Hello, hello. Today is the matchup graphs quarterback, running back, receiver compared to a player's normal. So this week we got Daniels in the top right. He hasn't been the same recently, mainly because he hasn't been rushing the same. He's got that rib injury. That is the big question mark because he is set up extremely well. So hopefully a little bit healthier. He doesn't do himself favors. Everyone compares him to Lamar. Lamar protects himself extremely well. Jayden Daniels is the exact opposite of that. So that is also like the worry there. But Dallas, obviously not the greatest, but they also run a ton of man defense. Correlates a lot to rushing fantasy points for a scrambling quarterback. Nobody scrambles more, at least when he's healthy, than Jayden Daniels. And we look at the two rushing quarterbacks that Dallas has played this year. Lamar, 14 carries. I think that might be a season high. 70 yards and a touchdown. Jalen Hurts, 7 for 56 and multiple touchdowns on the ground. Set up extremely well. If he's healthy, he'd be my number one quarterback. That's obviously just a big question mark. Herbert right here, he's been amazing as of late. 22 points per game over this past month. Before that, I don't think he hit 20 a single time. So consistent and high scoring, throwing downfield, and the volume is there. He's number 6 in air yards. That matters especially this week because against Baltimore, they have a good rushing defense, but they're 31st against explosive pass plays as well. I think 30th against the pass in general. But man, they allow those big plays. Ladd and the other guys have been getting it. I'll talk about Ladd later. But it mates Herbert's strengths really well so far. I like him overall. Mahomes, still not amazing. More of a running back day. Horrible game script there. Knicks versus the Raiders. Played them in week 5, and he had 23 points. And that means more to me because if we look at another guy like Lamar Jackson, if I said he scored 23 points against Las Vegas, it's like, oh, he kind of does that every week. But at that time of Bo Nix's career, he was only scoring like 12 to 14 points the first 4 weeks. And then week 5, he blew up and had 23. That was his first coming out day in terms of being an NFL quarterback. Las Vegas, passing D, overall their strength is on the outside and stopping those big plays. Sean Payton, that's not his strength in terms of play calling and what he wants to do. A lot of those running back targets, lots of those short targets, take what the defense gives you. Not a huge damper on Bo Nix's success there, and he's obviously got his rushing. Baker, kind of right here in the middle, gets Evans back. The downside, the Giants' defense isn't like horrible. And I think the perception would probably be that they're bad because they're the Giants, and you look at their offense too. But their defense isn't bad. They're above average against the pass. A little bit worse against rushing quarterbacks, but I don't think Baker will need to do that a ton this week. DeVito's on the other side. They also pressure the quarterback really well. The thing that Tampa Bay does the best is they keep Baker clean. Number 1 in terms of pressure rate allowed, but Giants have good pressure, and they're also number 1 against tight ends. So Mike Evans is back, yes, but first game back, and really your only other weapon is your tight end in Auden, and they're best against that. Makes it a little tougher for Baker. Still a quarterback 1 for me this week, but not incredible. And Kyler, I try so hard to find good stats that I believe in, that have context, and actually help me form an opinion on different things. Kyler, it's impossible this week. Look at his points per game. That's probably what he's going to score. Seattle, compared to the average NFL defense versus quarterbacks, is a 0.0 points per game difference. When you're adjusting it to their competition, they are very balanced all over in terms of their coverage, even their history. It was a different defense, different coach, obviously. But his last 3 years, he's played them 4 times. Kyler, 17 points, 17 points, 16 points, and 19 points. Like it's as even as you can possibly get. Solid for Marv, so I'll talk about that later more. Anthony Richardson up in this top left. An interesting one. It's basically a worse version of last week's matchup. So he played the Jets last week, and what do we know about the Jets is obviously they have a good passing defense. Against rushing quarterbacks, they're not great. It's actually really bad. And we saw that last week too. 28 points against the Jets. Richardson, it doesn't really matter as much in terms of how good a passing defense is. The Lions, a better version of that. They run the most man defense in the league. Richardson, more of his rushing is design work, that power quarterback. He's not as much of a scrambler, but still more than the average quarterback. And they are really good against the pass, especially just compared to, they allow stuff to the receivers, but to a quarterback, really good against the pass. Not amazing against rushing quarterbacks. Not horrible, but worse than average. So it sets up where Richardson, a lot better than people would expect, even just looking at the matchup as a whole. Detroit's probably going to score 40 points again, so that kind of helps him too there. Purdy, Purdy has been a lot better this year in terms of his his volume, and being a fantasy quarterback has been super consistent. In the past, his volume's been low. He's kind of depended on if he's the one scoring the touchdowns in the blowout. The defense does their job. But this year, they're 5-4, 5-5, something like that. And they play Green Bay. Should be another close one. Weapons starting to come around too. He's had 19 points in 5 straight games. I think he's projected 16th in volume right here. But he's been closer to like that top 10 mark. So he's still solid. The thing to look for, at least solid for being in a bad matchup, the thing to look for would be playing in Green Bay on the road in November. Weather, probably not the best. And then Maye, we got in the bottom left here. Miami was number one in against quarterbacks for a long time. And everyone kind of thought, including myself, Tua is going to come back. How does that affect things? How much is it the game script? How much is it's actually secondary? They have a good secondary, but they're now 4th. So in those 4 games of Tua, how much has it shifted? This last month, they have been 18th against pass. Worse than average. Maye has the rushing too. I'm a big Maye guy in general. So a lot better than this would suggest. Actually a pretty good play this week in my opinion. On to the running backs. We got 2 guys that are kind of the RB1 and RB2 that people aren't really talking about. Like everyone sees Henry and Barkley. The guys that I think are kind of right there with them, there's not much of a difference, is McCaffrey still and Achane. McCaffrey hasn't had that blowout game yet, but he is number 1 in terms of projected volume, and through 2 weeks, right off of injury, number 1 in volume. The volume has been there. Nothing incredible so far, but the blow-up is going to come eventually. And then we got Achane, similar situation. They are both really good defenses, both really good against receiving running backs. Achane is a little bit different because a lot of his receiving comes either designed or him playing in the slot or out wide. And against the slot, at least, New England is below average. So I'm not too worried about him there. McCaffrey is McCaffrey. Doesn't really matter. Sunday Night Football, we got the 2 studs over here playing against each other, aforementioned, Barkley versus Kyren Williams. Barkley, this is not a big hit at all. It's one of those where like the Rams are slightly better than average at basically everything. So then they end up being like 8th best against running backs. It's really not that different compared to normal. Just the rank looks a little better. And then Kyren, the thing for him is the touchdown upside. So the Eagles have been elite against the pass this year, or at least recently. Pass kind of all year. But those rookie corners, I mentioned it. If you look back at like a week 3 or week 4 video, they weren't like putting up incredible numbers in terms of stopping fantasy guys, but I was like, from what I've seen, they look really good. And now I look really smart saying that. They've been great against the pass. Tough matchup for Puka, okay for Kupp, but they have been the number 1 defense against the pass for a decent amount of weeks in a row, and they haven't really allowed many points against a lot of good teams. We see good offenses. Let me check real quick. I know like the Bengals scored 17 against them 2 weeks ago. Jags scored 23, but like Giants got 3 points, Browns 16, Saints 12, Falcons 22. Like they've been good overall. Cowboys 6 and Commanders last week 18. So they've had a good defense just week to week in terms of touchdowns allowed. And with Puka and Kupp back on the field, a lot of Kyren's fantasy work just depends on does he get into the end zone. And it's going to be harder this week. We look at Gibbs, an obvious must start. Another Detroit 40-point blow-up that I was talking about, very likely versus Indy this week. Stevenson right below him. He has been so consistent in his snaps and his volume. I had a stat about a month ago where I was like, oh, in games where he's played 70% of the snaps and they're not kind of putting him in the doghouse, he's been incredible in fantasy. And that's kind of continued. Not amazing last week, about 10 points. But that is looking like his floor. He had 20 carries again. He has 20 carries in 3 of his last 4 games. Miami right here, they are poor against receiving running backs. That's why they're in the green. They're actually not bad on the ground. So we look at his receiving. He is just more a check down guy in this offense. It's not the Stevenson we saw last year or even 2 years ago. It's kind of like the better example of Stevenson's old receiving. And that's okay. It's not amazing, but I think he is a solid RB2 flex guy for this week. James Conner kind of in this center right here. Again, not a ton of receiving this season. A lot of it has been on the ground, and it's a better matchup for him. Main reason, They have the #1 offensive line advantage on the week against Seattle. Offensive line for Arizona, way better than the defensive line for Seattle in yards before contact allowed, adjusted. So set up really well. And we look at the last time that he played Seattle. He only played him one time last year. It was the very last game. He had 30 touches for 200 yards. Works out well usually. Javonte in this bottom right, I don't trust it. Peyton, you look at the coach speak all week. He's just like, we'll see who plays running back. We'll see. I'll wake up that day and decide. It's not a guarantee that Javonte even gets more than one carry like a couple of weeks ago. So don't really think it's a risk or worth the risk unless you kind of are screwed with bye weeks this week. Good matchup. I just wouldn't love it. On the same side, if you have a ton of bye weeks and you need someone to send a prayer for, Estime, not that bad of an option actually. We look over at Tracy right next to him. Similar to Stevenson, actually, the Tampa Bay #1 in zone coverage rate. They don't run man at all. And a lot of the times, that means running back targets. Definitely for Tampa Bay. Last 5 weeks, they've allowed like 30 targets, 25 catches, 200 some yards, and 3 touchdowns. By far the worst in the NFL. And on the season, again, last against receiving running backs. Really good on the ground, but last against receiving running backs. So then I looked at DeVito. I kind of assumed, like a lot of these backup quarterbacks, lots of checkdowns, lots of throws to tight ends usually. DeVito, a little bit of a red flag because that wasn't really his game last year when he did play. He had 6 starts, so I looked at all of them, and he had Barkley. That's the other thing, is you'd expect him to throw a lot to Barkley. Barkley had 1 massive game, 2 receiving touchdowns, decent amount of targets, receptions, and yards. He had another game with 6 targets and like no receiving yards still, like 3 or 4. And then the other 4 games didn't really do anything. Like it was all kind of like 2 targets, 3 targets. That's like the worry. Just a lot of it depends on the receiving. So very much like the graph would suggest, low floor, high ceiling for him. Dobbins in this red by a little bit. Not the greatest matchup for him. Like I was talking about with Herbert in Baltimore earlier, they are good against the ground. And they're bad, like a lot of their passing defense, in terms of receiving running backs. Dobbins, he's got him more this year, and he has the ability. I will say that time and time again. One of my biggest pet peeves is people talking about receiving running backs versus non-receiving running backs. Sometimes it's how they're used. Dobbins can be a receiving running back. They just don't use him that way, really. And that's not really their offense. It's not really how Herbert plays ever since Eckler has left, at least, especially in this new offense. So that's the worry. Baltimore does the 5th best defensive line. So Chargers, their pass protection is amazing. Run blocking, way improved, but not insanely good or anything. Henry, just compared to his normal, not incredible. Volume will always be a little bit lower because the passing usage, but obviously, it's Henry. Who cares? And then Hubbard, all the way in the left here. I'll always say it. Kansas City against running backs this year. Like even last week, I was had something in the Friday Fast Facts video about like Cook. Led off the video with how he's kind of not the greatest option. Then he scores 2 touchdowns. He scored 2 touchdowns. He still had 27 yards of scrimmage yards, receiving and rushing. Like they are just so good. That's what you're banking on. You're just praying for a touchdown. Not really something you want to do in the Panthers offense. They have a -8 points per game to running backs compared to a player's average. So Hubbard, who's averaging 16, you would expect with this matchup to have around 8 on average. That's not really going to cut it for most teams. And my favorites, the receivers, only 2 shadows on the week. There is not many at all. One of them, doesn't matter, kind of like I always say, Deonte Banks, getting the shadow on Mike Evans. So Evans, basically right in the center in terms of matchups. Banks is second to last, around that range. And guys that have played more than 100 snaps, actually, he is last in the NFL in fantasy points allowed per route. But he plays the best receivers every single week, guards them every single snap. So he's a solid corner, but in terms of shadowing the #1 receiver, nothing that you're going to be afraid of. And then we got Gonzalez on Hill. Tyreek Hill, I don't think he even played against the Patriots earlier this year. Or they haven't played yet. No, they have played. Earlier this year, he played him 10 targets, 6 catches for 69 yards. That was without Tua. That's what I was thinking. Tua wasn't there. 10 targets, 6 or 69. Not good in fantasy, average NFL day overall. Gonzalez, is a really good corner, one of the best, especially out of that class, probably the best corner just off the top of my head. Then we're looking at this top right. Nabers, talking more DeVito. Last year in his 6 starts, he averaged 150 yards per game and a touchdown. So like in a standard league in terms of receiving points, just not like guessing receptions. 21 receiving points available. That makes it tougher for a guy like Nabers. Like obviously he had Daniel Jones before. Like it's not that much of a drop off, if any. But still, that affects it a lot. Top right, because defense isn't really good against receivers. And Josh Hayes is going to be in there again for injury reasons for Tampa Bay. Overall, their defensive back and secondary pretty solid, but Hayes, who's only played 87 snaps, would be the worst corner in the NFL in fantasy points allowed per route. Only 87 snaps, so like a few games worth of snaps or routes run against them. So that is the big advantage. The 40% of the time that Nabers is on that side, big plays definitely available for him. He was a converted safety, 6th-round pick out of a couple years ago. So definitely, I don't think it would be too much change, not knowing too much about him outside of that. I don't think he was a backup for a reason. No offense. JSN, up in this top right. I think it's the first time he's been in the top right in a really long time just because his volume has been increasing. His past 2 games, I know one of them was without DK, but another one was with DK. He is number 1 in the NFL in air yards. Rare for a slot guy, and even more rare looking at the rest of JSN's history. This is how he was used at Ohio State. He could play on the outside. I know, like, it's going to sound so stupid saying this. In high school, he played on the outside, like a lot of these guys would. He was like the number 2 or 3 receiver in the country. He can play all over. He did that at Ohio State, and then eventually kind of his last year was that slot-only guy with Olave and Wilson there. But a lot of times, they threw to him downfield. 2 weeks ago, no DK. They threw him to him downfield a ton. Last week, DK comes back. Still, 10 targets. Throws to him downfield a ton. That is how you use him. He's not going to be an incredible yards after catch bot, but he's just savvy, incredible route runner, and can get downfield as a slot guy. Hopefully, they keep using him that way. McConkey versus Baltimore. Again, the explosive pass plays. Baltimore has struggled against it. Wiggins is their best corner in terms of stats. I know Marlon Humphrey, Pro Bowler, he's going to be in the slot, but in terms of the fantasy points allowed, a lot of it not his fault, really, just coverage things. Has been not the greatest against receivers. And we look at the catches that Ladd had last week. Again, as a slot guy, the catches, 20 yards, 11, 19, 18, 28, and 27. Bengals are a similar defense in their secondary. They allow a lot of big plays. They aren't great against the pass. I think that's his blow-up spot for Ladd again. Should see the volume just with how this game could go. Like him a lot this week. Love Ladd in general. He's a beast. He's still underrated. Still underrated. DJ Moore right below him. He had 4 designed targets last week in this new offense. Led the NFL for that week. They want to use him. They want to use him. Minnesota, not great against receivers. The worry for me, though, here is Flores versus Caleb Williams. Usually, this is not the defense you want to go against as a rookie quarterback. Does that affect DJ Moore? Probably. Hopefully, keeps that design work, gets those easy catches. Maybe we get a big play or 2, those yards after catch. Think he's a solid flex guy, I would say, this week. Marvin Harrison Jr. in this green. It's been months. It's been months. We look at his matchup. Witherspoon is in the slot. He's kind of their best guy, even though he does more than just being a cover corner. Tyreek Woolen, again, good. Joby on the outside. I think that's how you pronounce his name. Seahawks fans can let me know. Joby on the outside. He's going to be the main primary cover corner on Marv. Him and Woolen will get him 90% of the time. And they are just slightly below average against those outside receivers. Usually, it's a guy that kind of gloss over. Oh, it's an average matchup, that sort of thing. But we look at the matchups that Marv has had. They have been horrible. Horrible. Just looking at the Cardinals' schedule, if you know anything about secondaries or who's playing corner, defenses against receiver in terms of fantasy, all that, here's his last few matchups. The Jets, the Bears, the Dolphins, the Chargers, the Packers, the 49ers. Like 6 straight games of just brutal, like top 10 defenses on the outside. He's been in hell. They're coming off the bye week. They want to get him the ball. It's a matchup that's been better than what he's had in almost 2 months. So hopefully it's a good week for him. Like Marv this week, especially with the bye weeks. Downs going back to this right side. Downs, I talk about him so much, and he's just like, it's because he is more predictable, and you can kind of guess with Downs easier based on the stats. Richardson, I've kind of been very against Downs. He had his second out of his 4 games now were with Richardson. He did really well. Nothing incredible, but did really well. Was again that leading receiver, and he's in a spot where he matches up against Detroit really well. I was talking about how they're good against quarterbacks, but not amazing against receivers. And there's 2 things. Against the outside, they're not bad. In the slot, they are last against slot receivers. 2, they run a lot of man coverage. The number 1 receiver by a decent bit against man coverage for the Colts is Josh Downs. Not a surprise there. Overall, he's killed the deep middle of that passing game with Richardson. That's where a lot of those big fantasy points have come, is those deep in breakers, seam routes with Richardson and Josh Downs, crossers. And that isn't really a weakness of Detroit, but it's not their strength. Not their strength, I would say. So I think he has the opportunity to have a high ceiling this week in a tough spot. Definitely the game script. It's probably going to be there. Sorry, Colts fans. McLaurin in this middle center right here. He's always been boom or bust. But these last few weeks, I'll have a fact for you later in that Friday video. The volume hasn't been great. It's been decreasing. Jayden Daniels hasn't been amazing. The offense is definitely more not as creative with Jayden Daniels' lack of rushing. All that sort of stuff hasn't been there. And then you look at Diggs. He's going to be on him about 75% of the time. Trayvon Diggs. It's not a shadow, but they play very high tendencies on sides. They are a side team in terms of their corners. So it's not like, oh, they'll go 50-50 on either outside corner. Like Diggs plays one side 80% of the time. And then same thing on the other side, the very rare situation is Washington plays I hate it so much, but they play receivers on sides. And he plays on Diggs' side 80% of the time. He's very rarely in the slot or as the right wide receiver. So they don't even have like X and Z's. They just like have left receivers. It's so stupid, but that's how it is. So McLaurin, not set up the greatest. If I had to guess if it's a boom or bust week, even with like, the positive matchup against Dallas, I would say like there's a good chance he would bust this week, sadly. Hopefully not. Hopefully I'm wrong. Then we got Jennings and Samuel next to him. Probably the question I've gotten the most this week is like rest of the season. Who would I rather have, Debo or Jennings? And I think this kind of explains my answer perfectly. The snaps this year, they have 215 to 214. They both play in the slot about 45% of the time, outside about 55% of the time, to their first read share. Like, okay, they're playing the same position basically. Who's kind of getting the first reads, the main receiver in that offense? Well, they're basically the exact same. So it goes back to how Ayuk and Debo were. So if you liked Ayuk more than Debo in the past, Jennings is probably your guy, and vice versa. The air yards are going to go to Jennings. He's going to be that downfield threat. The yards are to catch. Obviously, that's Debo's specialty. They are a balanced coverage team in terms of Green Bay. So really, basically even is what I'm saying this week. In the future, if you see tweets or anything like it, or I'll say it, it's going to matter a lot on the coverage teams. If they are a high man coverage team, it's better for Jennings just because of Debo's insane tendencies. Zone team, if they play like Tampa Bay, say that, number 1 against zone coverage, that's where we'd expect Debo to do a lot better. Courtland Sutton, I said I would talk about him later. Here we are. He has been awesome. He was a guy that I was out on before the season. A lot of that was with Bo Nix. No offense to Bo Nix, but just rookie quarterback in that situation. And the amount of touchdowns that Sutton scored last year was just completely unsustainable. First half of the season, I looked smart saying that. Lately, Sutton's been great. And I like doing in-season content better because it's easier now that we see the numbers. I am confident in Sutton going forward. A lot is the volume. 11 targets, 10 targets, 9 targets, 8 targets. It's gone down 1 each week, but still 8 to 11 targets in 4 straight games. The end zone targets still there compared to Russ last year. Now we see Russ and Pickens with that. Nix is still doing that with Sutton. He's 3rd in the NFL in end zone targets. That's a good sign, especially since he hasn't he's probably underscored. I think he has 3 touchdowns on like 11 end zone targets, something like that. So lots of scoring opportunities in this matchup. Not the greatest matchup on paper, but in terms of if you think Denver is going to score 34 points again, then Courtland Sutton, an easy start. Let me look up real quick. What did he do against Las Vegas last time that they played? Again, when he wasn't playing as well, so I'm guessing he wasn't incredible. He was not. 5 targets, 2 catches, 32 yards. But at the same time, that was when his first 7 or 8 weeks, he wasn't really good. He played New Orleans, and he had that goose egg, 0 targets. And ever since then, 11 targets, 8 receptions, 100 yards. 10 targets, 7 receptions, 122 yards. 6 for 70 and a touchdown, and then 7 for 78 last week. Like, he's been amazing. Wide receiver 1 over this past month. Not in total, but top 12 guy, you know. So really like him, even in a tougher matchup this spot. I think he's fine, playable. And we'll end with the bottom left guys. Doubs and Reed. Similar with the San Francisco guys. This week, there's not really an answer. I will say, weather's probably not going to be great. Recently, it's been low volume, and with all the receivers there, that really affects it because it's so spread around evenly. Hats off to LaFleur, hats off to Jordan Love. In terms of fantasy, it's annoying when all 5 of the receivers, if you count Kraft as that 5th receiver, are healthy. The volume is lower, it's really hard to guess, and San Francisco is good. So it makes it tough. They're fine plays because the bye weeks, I get it. I'm just saying it's more of a guess. Thank you guys for watching. Going home. So a lot of this content is not going to have this background. It's going to have a really different, probably a lot worse background and everything else going on. We'll see how it goes. See you guys soon.